Okay, everybody, I hope this is working. This is my first attempt at streaming, so we will see. Okay. I am here. I was just showing you the review sheet that I should have reposted because I've changed it a little bit, and I will do that because I'm going to repost all of them together, probably with a few revisions. In any case, what we're talking about today is Congress. Okay, Congress, and this is the review sheet that I'm working off of, and I also have the PowerPoint here so that we can use that for a couple of slides. All right. So the first topic is bicameralism. Why do we have a two-house Congress? As you all know, one of the things that happened at the Constitutional Convention is that they had a dispute about representation, whether it should be by population or whether it should be a fixed number per state. And the compromise that they reached was to have, one of the parts of the compromise was to have two chambers, and one of those chambers would be based on population while one of them was based on a fixed number. Okay, so we got the House and the Senate. You need to know what the requirements are to be a representative or a senator. Some of these will show up in multiple choice questions. To be a representative, you need to be 30 or 25. To be a senator, you need to be 30, I believe it is. And a representative serves a term of 2 years, while a senator serves a term of 6 years. There are 2 senators per state, whereas the number of House representatives per state depends upon the population, obviously. California has 53 House representatives and 2 senators. If I get that right, California's population changes frequently, and that number changes, of course, when the population changes, and the census determines that the numbers changed in the census every 10 years. Of course, you have to be a citizen also to be a representative or a senator. Okay. The demographics of the members of Congress. Congress does not really represent the U.S. demographically. They are more white, they are more male, they are more Christian, they are older. Okay, and that of course shapes their views. They tend to be a little more conservative, you might say, compared to the population at large because of those differences. Now, as we were just saying, each member of Congress is attached to a particular district in a state. Excuse me for a second. There is only one winner from each of these districts when we have congressional elections. And this leads partially to the two-party system because you want to make your vote count. If you vote for somebody other than the winner, your vote really isn't going to count. So you're trying to maximize your chances of voting for the winner. To do that, you choose one of the top parties, one of the parties that has the possibility of winning. That means that third parties suffer a lot. People tell them that if they vote for a candidate, then they're wasting their vote, and they could have been voting for one of the top 2 people and helps determine that the winner of that race. Okay, so let's look again. Okay, remember that when the census does determine that there needs to be a change in the number of districts in a state, that the state legislatures are the ones who draw those boundaries. This makes the composition of the state legislatures very, very important because whoever controls the state legislature controls how the redistricting is done, and those districts obviously favor the party that leads the state legislature, as well as the race, to be quite honest. Okay. Now, one of the most important factors in determining who will win a congressional race is whether or not there is an incumbent in the race, someone who is running for re-election. They have been in office and they are running for re-election. Okay, so there are several important advantages of being an incumbent, aside from the fact that a lot of people will vote for you because you're an incumbent. One is the sophomore surge. All right. And the sophomore surge is the fact that, for some reason, sophomores in their second year of Congress, in the House, in the second term, of the House, tend to, when they run for re-election for that term, they tend to have an advantage. Nobody can really figure out why, but that's true, okay? We also have an advantage in campaign finance. If you are an incumbent, then the people who are running the, deciding how much money to give to a candidate are going to want to vote on the winning horse. They don't sometimes care as much about the party as they do about making sure they donate to the one who's going to be in Congress and will be able to help them and provide for their interests. So if you are an incumbent, you have a lot better chance of raising money. Okay? A lot better chance. It's a significant difference. Another advantage that you have when you are an incumbent is that you have been able to provide help to your constituents through your term, okay? And so those constituents will appreciate your help, and it will look like you are actually doing something to help the people. You get a record of that. They know what your experience is of helping constituents. You have a lot more access to media as an incumbent because they see you as more of a newsmaker. You actually attract attention, more attention, they think, more money, etc. You have more experience. If you're an incumbent, you have a record that you can rely on. You're not just relying on your promises. And people can check your record and see what you've actually done to see if they like that. Another small privilege that you have that's actually probably more important than you might think is the franking privilege. Franking privilege allows members of Congress to send out mail to their constituents. There's a limit for how much they can spend each year, but it's a pretty high limit. And so they keep in touch with their constituents by sending out these little newsletters that tell you when they're appearing for a town hall and tell you what their positions are and current issues are. Right? And that they don't have to pay for that. If you want to communicate and you're not an incumbent and you want to send out newsletters to the people, you don't get that privilege. Now, obviously, they can't be raising money letters. They can't be campaign letters, but they can be showing the people, their constituents, what it is that they have been doing while they're in Congress. Another simple fact about incumbency is that people recognize the incumbent's name. They've been in office, they've been in the news, they're more likely to see their name, and sometimes that makes a difference about who people vote for. They get there, they want to vote for a good candidate, and they only recognize one name, so they figure that must be it. Another way you help yourself as an incumbent is pork barrel legislation. If you've been able to convince the Congress to pass a law that favors your own district in some way, establishes a new military base, or provides for new highway funds, could be anything, new bridges, okay, then you are gaining attention from your constituents and they're favorable to you for that, okay. Finally, one of the big advantages of being an incumbent is that you get to help affect redistricting. Now, next on the list is congressional functions, okay. These are things that you really need to remember. There are three principal functions of Congress. Two of them are legislative. One is passing bills, passing new legislation, and the other is oversight of the executive and bureaucracy in implementing and applying those bills. Okay? The third role of Congress is constituency service, what we call casework, helping their constituents if they have a problem. You can call your senator or your representative and say, I can't get the IRS to listen to me, or I can't get some other government department to pay attention to me, the EPA, who knows? Okay, can you please help me? And if a member of Congress then contacts somebody who's, working on those issues, they might be more willing to be reasonable, shall we say, with the constituent. Okay? Now, the other thing, actually we'll probably talk about elections more in a second, but one of the things to remember in congressional elections is that if you want to predict who's going to win, you look for the incumbent. Okay? If there's no incumbent, then you know what you're hoping for is that if you want a challenge for the seat, is that there is no incumbent, and that will obviously help you win if the seat is open. Or it could be that the incumbent has a scandal that you think you can defeat them on, but it's difficult to defeat an incumbent. If you want to know, however, how a particular voter is likely to vote in a congressional election, you look at their party identification. The same is true for president. What party do they identify with? That's going to tell you better who they're going to vote for. Okay? If you want to know who's going to win, though, you look at the incumbent. Okay? One of the amendments you need to know in connection with Congress has to do with the Senate. This is the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment provided that the election of senators would no longer be done by the state legislatures. Instead, it would be done by popular election. So this is related to suffrage. We've talked about it with respect to suffrage because it relates to voting for a particular office. This obviously was something that the progressives wanted during the progressive era, and that's when it was accomplished. Now, what difference does it make that incumbents win? Okay, what difference does it make? What consequences are there? And one of the things you're going to want to be able to do on the exam is to link these to the larger political process. As you do with all the other issues, you need to be able to connect them to the other issues in government. Okay? So, for one thing, if you keep electing the same person, it gives you better continuity over time. You get similar positions on legislation, you get similar behavior in response to to legislation that people propose, that sort of thing. Okay. You get, and consistent with that, you get less radical change. If you do get change, it's less radical because you tend to have the same people who are there over time. Okay. You get people who have more experience. Experience helps people resolve issues better. They have more knowledge of what happened last time and what might happen in the future. They have more established relationships with the other members of Congress, and so that sometimes promotes effective legislation. They also have better relationships with interest groups. They've had people bugging them over time, and sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not so much a good thing. It could be corruptive if the interest group donates money to a PAC that donates to the candidate and then expects the candidate to do what the interest group wants. And it's a quid pro quo. Another thing that happens with incumbents being elected all the time is that people tend to specialize over time as they are in Congress. They tend to become experts at particular issues. It could be foreign policy, it could be immigration, it could be healthcare, things like that. A disadvantage of incumbency is that since we have more straight white men, Christian straight white men in Congress, if we elect incumbents, then we're re-electing more straight white men. So that means that there are fewer women and there are fewer minorities. One of the most interesting things about the midterm election in 2018 is that we got more women and minorities elected because of the wave, the blue wave. One last thing that happens because of incumbency is incumbents get a little lackadaisical. They tend to pay less attention to their constituents over time. Okay, so that they're less responsive, and that is a negative aspect of incumbency. Okay, let me look at the PowerPoint and see what I want to show you in the doc. I've got these in a little different order, and that's why. So let's just go ahead and talk about the congressional leadership in each house. Okay. So, as you know, there are certain types of leaders in each house. The House has a type of leader that the Senate doesn't have called the Speaker of the House. You need to know what the Speaker does. You need to know that the Speaker helps control committee assignments. They help control scheduling. They help control what happens to bills. They help control who gets on committee. Oh, I said that, committee assignments. Okay. They help control policy. Okay. That sort of thing. There are majority leaders in each house. The majority leader is the person from the party who has been elected by their party to be the majority leader. It's the party in the majority, obviously, that elects the majority leader, and the party in the minority elects the minority leader for each house. Now, in the Senate, the majority leader is very important because there is no speaker. So the majority leader is the one who controls to a greater extent what happens to bills, whether they're killed or not, Our current majority leader, McConnell, is very effective at killing bills. Okay. They also determine committee assignments, which is very important, that sort of thing. Okay. Minority leaders do the same sort of thing for their own party. They help determine committee assignments. They get a say in that for their own party. All right. And then there are the whips. We need to talk about the whips. Each house has whips and each party has whips. And the whips are basically the go-betweens between the party leadership and the membership. They help communicate what's going on to the leadership, and they help from the membership, and they help tell the membership what the leadership is considering and deciding. Okay? And they also try to whip up the vote. They try to get people to vote when a vote comes up. Okay, committees. Let's talk about the House committees, or the committees in the Congress, both houses. Okay, first of all, there are 4 types: standing, select, joint, conference. Most of the committees are standing committees. They are permanent committees. Okay, members serve on multiple committees and subcommittees. Each committee also has several subcommittees. Okay, so members of the Senate serve on more committees and subcommittees than members of the House. All right, now in determining position on a committee, seniority is very, very important. Determining the chair of the committee, seniority is very important. There are other considerations, especially in the Senate, because seniority was a problem. But generally speaking, it's either the most senior person in the majority party who chairs the committee, or a very senior person in the party who chairs the committee. Okay? Now let's go back to the types of committees. Standing committees, as I said, are permanent committees. They are subject matter committees related to the subject matter. Okay? And they are on all sorts of things. Let's look at, let's see if I can find a list. Okay, we need to find that list. Not there, not there, not there, not there. Right here. Okay, so I want you to, we're actually going to read through this list because some of you could only think of the Agriculture Committee when I asked you what committees there were. So we need to just remind you what kinds of committees are there. First of all, there's an Agriculture Committee in both houses, although the Senate's is called Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. There's an Appropriations Committee in both houses. That's about deciding how to spend government money. The Armed Services Committee in both houses talks about the armed services. It supervises the military. Okay? Both houses have a budget committee that participates in deciding how much they plan to spend on things. Remember that revenue bills and appropriation bills always begin in the House. We'll get to that in a second too. Okay, both houses have a committee that has to do with education and the workforce. They call them different things, but there is an education-related committee and a labor-related committee. They both have energy and commerce-related committees, okay? They have transportation-related committees. They combine these in different ways, but they also both have an ethics committee. The Senate Ethics Committee is a select committee. Those are specific committees that were originally intended to be temporary, but sometimes have been made permanent, like the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, okay, Select Intelligence Committees. Both houses have energy/natural resources committees. Natural resources obviously has to do with all sorts of things. Mining, drilling, finding other sorts of resources, okay? They have a Foreign Affairs or Foreign Relations Committee. They both have Homeland Security Committees. They both have, again, the Select Intelligence Committee. They both have Judiciary Committees, which supervise the courts. They both have Rules Committees. The House Rules Committee is very, very important. When a bill comes to the full floor of the House, then the Rules Committee decides what's going to happen to that committee on the floor, how much amendment will be allowed, how many speakers, how much debate will be allowed, that sort of thing, okay, which control a lot the consideration of the bill on the full floor. They both have committees about small business. They both have committees about veteran affairs. They have committees about banking and housing and urban affairs. The House has what's called a Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee is very important. It deals with the appropriations and revenue bills that must originate in the House. The revenue bills must originate in the House. The appropriations bills just do out of tradition. Okay? And so that means that those bills have to go through that committee. And controlling the money is very, very important. Follow the money. Okay? The House also has a committee on oversight and government reform that is specifically intended to overlook the executive department and the bureaucracy. Even though all the other committees also perform oversight, this is specifically intended to address issues kind of like what's going on now with the president. Okay, the Oversight Committee has been active. And then the House of Representatives also has a Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Okay, so I went through all those, even though it's boring, because you need to know the types of committees. You could get an FRQ that asks you what could Congress do about something, and you might want to know what committees were active, and you could talk about the committees and their what they're doing and what they could do in response to some action that the College Board has asked you about. Okay. So we've talked about standing committees and select committees. Let's talk about joint committees. Joint committees are committees that have members of both the Senate and the House on them. They are permanent committees. I don't even remember the name of them right now. There aren't very many of them. There are about 4 of them, something like that. And they address issues of joint concern to both houses. And then finally, there are conference committees, which are also joint committees, but they are temporary. Okay, so we don't classify them as joint committees. Conference committees arise when there is a bill that has passed the House and has passed the Senate, but it has taken different forms in the houses. So in order to pass the bill, it needs to be identical in both houses. So the conference committee gets together and they work on a compromise between the House and the Senate bill. Once they have that compromise, they send it back out to the House and the Senate where it's voted on. Okay, and if it passes, obviously it goes to the president for either signing or veto. Okay. The standing committees, I may not have said, but I should, are most important in considering legislation and in the oversight function of the Congress. Okay. Committee recommendations from the standing committees are very, very important. They tend to influence to a great extent what a member of Congress will do about the bill that the committee is sending to the floor. Obviously, there are a lot of bills that excuse me for a second, I got myself all messed up. Okay, there are a lot of bills that have opposition in the House or in the Senate, so you get votes where all the members of the majority party vote one way and the members of the minority party vote the other way. And so how those parties vote on the bill in committee affects the members of that party and how they vote on the floor. Okay, give me a second because, okay, there I go. I did something that I didn't know what I did. All right. The committee work continues after a bill goes to the floor. They're not just about recommending the committee to recommending the bill to the House floor. They work on trying to get it passed. Okay? And obviously, if the minority committee is opposed to it, they work that way. And if the majority committee supports it, they work that way, that sort of thing. So you try to recruit people to support the bill. And then if the bill goes to a conference committee, because both houses pass it, but it's different in each house, then oftentimes members of the committee, the subcommittee that's relevant to the bill, and the committee that's relevant to the bill end up on the conference committee to help reach some compromise. So there are term limits for serving as committee chair now, especially in the Senate, except for intelligence. I think I mentioned that, and I also have told you about the Ways and Means in the House Rules Committee. Okay, so remember that you have to know how a bill becomes a law. Okay, go watch Schoolhouse Rock again if you need to. There's a chart in the slides that is very helpful for this, I think. Why isn't my PowerPoint showing anymore? Okay. Oh, I see why. I see why. Okay. Sorry about that. That was, you had a black space there for a while, didn't you? Okay. A bill becomes a law. There we go. Sorry, you're having to watch this. There we go. Okay. How a bill becomes a law. First of all, it comes in, it gets a number. Okay. Then it gets assigned to a committee and to a subcommittee then after by the committee. Okay. They consider the bill, they consider the writing, they have hearings, they mark it up, which basically means they make changes to the bill. And eventually it gets to the full committee markup and gets voted on. It might not even be voted on. It might be buried in committee, okay? If it gets approved in the committee, then it goes to the full House, okay? It gets calendared in whatever fashion that particular House does it, okay? The majority leader basically does it in the Senate, and in the House, the Rules Committee does it, okay? And then it's voted on in the full House. If it gets passed and the versions are different, then it goes to a conference committee. Whatever comes out of that, the Congress, if it's passed, goes to the president for signing or veto. Okay. You definitely need to know that. Remember caucuses. Caucuses are groups that are formed by members of Congress on matters of common interest to the members. Okay, they can be formed on anything, about anything. They can have any members in them. A lot of them have members both of the Senate and the House. Sometimes they have members of both parties. Sometimes they don't. So, and they just kind of float around. They're not a part of the formal organization of the House. But what they do is they try to influence the Congress, not just the House, but the congressional action on matters of interest to the caucus. So if your caucus is about oil production, okay, you're going to try to support legislation that promotes oil production, okay, and probably oppose legislation that would inhibit your production, like environmental legislation. Don't forget the importance of the congressional staff. I don't know whether you would ever be asked about it, but members of Congress are not alone. They, have large support staffs, okay, that do lots of things for them. They respond to correspondence from constituents and others. They try to resolve problems that constituents bring up to the member of Congress. They help research legislation. They help write legislation, draft legislation. They do all sorts of things. They handle the calendar and things like that. Okay, let's see what's next. Okay, this is important. House and Senate differences. You're going to be asked a lot of multiple choice questions probably on this. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and use the PowerPoint on this for a second. So I hope, actually let me show you me while I change this. Change the slide that's showing. Sure hope this is working. Okay, cool. PowerPoint. Differences in the function under the Constitution. These are differences between the House and the Senate that are set forth in the Constitution, okay? First of all, in the House, as we've discussed, all revenue bills have to originate in the House. If you want to raise money, if you want to tax people, that's what revenue bills are, okay? If you want to have a tariff, you've got to originate those bills in the House. Obviously, the House can impeach the president. The Senate has the trial on the president, but they do not impeach. The impeachment is the process of determining what charge to make against the president. Okay? Senate holds the trial to determine whether the president is guilty of the charge. The Senate has to approve treaties agreed to by the president. The president negotiates them and signs them, but they are not effective, not in force, unless the the Senate approves them. And the other thing that the Senate has to do under the Constitution is to approve presidential appointments for judges, appointments for cabinet members, appointments for other senior officials, leaders of the agencies. Not White House staff. They don't have to approve the White House counsel, for example, or the press secretary, or the head of communications in the White House, or the White House counsel. Okay? They only have to approve the senior agency leads that are not a part of the White House staff itself. Okay? So, how else are they different? These are not specifically stated in the Constitution. Many of them have arisen through tradition and custom and practice. Okay? The House is more centralized. It's more hierarchical, and it's more disciplined. The reason for this is largely the same as the reason for many of the other differences between the House and the Senate. The House is big, 435 members, big, okay? It's much more difficult to get work done with a big group, okay? So there's a more rigid organization, there's a more structured leadership and hierarchy in that leadership, okay? And they follow more rigid procedures to get their bills through the House, right? The leadership is more important in the House for the same reason. You've got to ride herd over your many people in the House and make sure that they behave the way you want them to and that all of the business goes the way that it's supposed to according to the rules. Committee structure is also very important because the House, the full House is so big, okay? The committees do much of the work. That's where you talk to people, where you mark up bills. You can't do that with 435 people. Okay? The House, members of the House are more likely to be policy specialists, more than likely because it works out that way again because of the size of the House, I think. You have to decide what you're going to focus on in the House. Party line voting is more common in the House. You tend to vote with your party more than senators do. Senators are more willing to stray from the party line. In the House, if you're a newbie, you don't have a whole lot of power. Okay, this is, it's interesting because we have a lot of new House members as a result of the midterm election of 2018, and a lot of those House members are getting a lot of attention, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But that doesn't mean they have a lot of power. It means they have a lot of public opinion power. Okay? Cortez, for example, Ocasio-Cortez is, driving the Republicans crazy. They ought to really spend more time thinking about policy and less time thinking about her. The House, because it does not have the filibuster rule, okay, can get more done, even though there's party polarization there, as there is elsewhere, okay? Because you only have to have a majority vote to win something. In the House, we have the filibuster, which essentially requires you to get 60% of the votes. So the Senate is more decentralized, okay? They are more deliberative. In other words, they're considered to ponder things and use their intelligence and their wisdom and their experience to make decisions. It's easier to bypass committees because you only have 100 people in the Senate. So sometimes you have matters that you can bypass the committees. It's easier to introduce amendments to bills. Okay, you don't have to make sure those all happen in committee. There are fewer limits on debate. You can talk as long as you want to, whereas in the House, the Rules Committee is going to limit that. You need 60 votes, as we were saying, to overcome a filibuster, 60%. All right? And these days, remember that you don't really need to actually filibuster. You just really need to say, I'm going to filibuster, and that's pretty much all it takes. The majority leader, as we discussed before, is more powerful in the Senate than in the House because you don't have a speaker that controls things. It's the majority leader in the Senate that does that. Okay. Give me 1 minute. Okay. Here I am again, just to let you see that I'm still here, even though you can still hear me talking, obviously. Okay. Let me see if I've missed anything on the, let's look at the, at the review sheet and see if I've missed anything. Oh, cloture. Remember that cloture is the process that occurs to try to end a filibuster. And to get cloture, you need 60% of the votes, just what you would need to get a vote on, to vote for whatever legislation is at issue. Okay. Trials. Okay, a couple of other procedures that occur in the Senate. You have something called unanimous consent. This arises, again, from the fact that you have fewer people in the Senate. If the Senate agrees basically to waive a rule, to decide that we're not going to follow a rule in this case, and we all agree on that, if they can get everybody to agree, then they can do it. Okay? If you want to move forward a bill by unanimous consent, it only takes one objection by one senator, okay, to prevent the bill from going forward. McConnell does that a lot, the majority leader of the Senate. Okay? A couple more things about the House. They have something called a discharge petition. That happens if a piece of legislation is caught in committee and it can't get out, somebody's not letting it out, okay, the committee that actually has it, but there are enough people in the House that want it to come out and want to vote on it, even though the committee won't let it out, you can get a discharge petition, which discharges the matter from the committee into the full House, and then they can vote on it regardless of what the committee's doing. All right? The Hastert rule, though I don't think you're going to need to know it, but I'll tell you what it is anyway in case it shows up. The Hastert rule relates to Denny Hastert, who used to be the Speaker of the House, and he decided that he wasn't bringing any matter up for a vote unless a majority of his own party, which were Republicans, okay, would vote for it. Unless the Republicans themselves could pass it, okay? Wasn't enough if you had enough votes among both the Democrats and Republicans. There had to be a majority of Republicans that would give a majority, not just a majority of Republicans, but a group of Republicans that could be a majority on the bill. Because he didn't want him to look bad. He thought it would look bad, I guess, if they didn't have a group of Republicans in the majority. The germaneness rule in the House affects amendments. You basically cannot bring an amendment on the floor, okay, and maybe even in committee, that's not related to the subject matter of the bill. For example, if it's a bill about the military, you can't try to attach some rider about abortion, okay? Finally, the House acts a lot as a committee of the whole. What does that mean? It means that special rules apply when they debate as a committee of the whole. Actually, it's not that special rules apply, it's that some of the special rules they have for debating as the whole House do not apply as committee of the whole, and it makes it easier to handle business, okay? So they'll often go, in order to discuss a matter, into a committee of the whole. Okay, where are we? Okay, still there with me? I hope so. What time is it? Wow, 11:37. Okay. Let's talk about influences on the members of Congress. Okay? This is one of the things that the College Board wants you to be able to talk about. So for one thing, the president obviously influences Congress. The president proposes legislation. The president talks about whether or not the president supports or opposes that legislation. The president might try to use the moral persuasion party's powers to convince members of Congress not only to agree with his viewpoint, but also the members of the public to pressure Congress to agree with his viewpoint, okay? A very important influence is whether or not the president says that he will veto a piece of legislation. If the president says, I'm going to veto this, whether you pass it or not, if you pass it, then Congress has maybe less motivation to go forward with it, especially if at least one house is aligned with the president's party, okay? Other influences on Congress, party and party polarization. There is a tremendous powerful force to vote with your party these days, okay, especially in the House. And there are a lot of extremes in the parties. If you're a moderate, you tend to get lost, okay? And the party really forces you as a moderate to vote with the party, even if it's an extreme that you don't want to vote with. Now, obviously, there are some people who won't do that, but they do most often, okay? So there are members of Congress who might talk about opposing something that President Trump has done, but when it comes time to supporting it, they'll vote for it, okay? In determining another influence on Congress is ideology, okay? If you want to know how a member of Congress is actually going to vote in Congress, the most important factor is the ideology of the member of Congress. Are they conservative? Are they liberal? What is their, or are they moderate? Okay, that's going to help you know where they're going to vote. And that's consistent with, actually, the fact that they're voting with their party, right? Okay, they're voting with the party, and their party is aligned by ideology. Okay, the constituency affects a member of Congress. Okay, their constituents, what the constituents want. Remember that there are actually three different models of representation. There's the trustee model, which says that the people vote for a representative because they trust the representative, and they trust the representative to do what is right. Okay, so even if the representative doesn't agree with the constituents and thinks there's another way to go that is more right, then the member of Congress is allowed to vote that way. That's what they're supposed to do. This was the framers' viewpoint, I think. They thought that the members of Congress should exercise independent insight and assessment of legislation, especially if they were in the Senate. Okay, because the Senate wasn't elected popularly when the framers made the Constitution. Okay, the members of the House, however, were supposed to be close to the people. They wanted them elected fairly often, every 2 years, so that they would have to go back to their members. They wanted them to know what their members thought. Now, if the theory of representation that is consistent with a member of Congress doing exactly what their constituents want is the delegate theory. They vote for the delegate. Okay? And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. They vote for the delegate, okay, and for the representative as their delegate, and the representative is supposed to do what the delegates want, even if the representative, him or herself, thinks that another thing would be the right way to go, okay? Then the third method or approach to representation is the political method, which is a mix of the delegate and the trustee. They try to do what the constituents want, but if they think that's really not the way to go, then they'll sometimes go the way of the trustee model, okay? Lobbyists affect members of Congress, okay? They obviously go to members of Congress and they try to get members of Congress to do what they want in connection with the interests that the lobbyist represents, okay? That could be passing legislation. It could have to do with oversight of the executive and the bureaucracy. It could have to, especially with the bureaucracy, okay? Log rolling, remember, is something that affects whether or not a member of Congress votes for what they would ordinarily vote for. Sometimes they will make a deal with another member of Congress. I'll vote for your bill if you vote for mine. Okay? And that leads them to vote against things they otherwise would vote for in order to get a vote in favor of their own legislation. Okay? Pork barrel is something that we've talked about and that influences members of Congress. Okay? They try to get legislation passed that does favor their district, and that will influence how they approach the legislation or whether they even themselves draft legislation and support it. Okay? Right, that's the whole review sheet. Okay? I want to do a couple of other things, and I'll go to the PowerPoint to do that. Okay? And let me go forward. Okay. We talked about incumbency in the elections. Okay. Talked about contact with the constituents. Let's talk about a couple of other things that actually we talked about casework and pork barrel. Those are both forms of credit claiming, so I was thinking that we didn't do that. One of the advantages, by the way, of being an incumbent is that a lot of times people don't want to run against you because they know how big an advantage incumbency is. So if you get somebody running against you, it's sometimes somebody who's really weak, somebody who, they know they can't win, but they have some reason of their own for running. All right, couple cases you need to know. Okay, have to do with how the districts are drawn. Okay, the Baker versus Carr, a case that was decided in 1961, dealt with whether or not somebody could even sue at all based on failure to reapportion the districts. Okay, and I believe it was in Kentucky. They had failed to reapportion their state districts, and people sued and said this is wrong. Basically, we have this principle of there should be one vote for every person. Okay, and that vote should matter the same for every person. And the fact that one district had 50,000 people in it and one district had 160,000 people in it makes their votes of different value. All right? And the court said that they could file that lawsuit, that it was possible for the court to decide that issue as a matter of equal protection law. So Baker versus Carr established the principle, okay, that you can sue based on the principle. The case never came back to the court to determine what they actually did about it, but they determined that you could sue. And then in Shaw versus Reno, they followed up on that and said that the one person, one vote principle applies to racial discrimination, okay? That you cannot gerrymander to exclude racial groups from representation, right? Remember that there are a couple of ways that they do gerrymandering, okay? One is packing and one is cracking. So let's say you have a group of African American people in your district, in your state, but they're all spread out, okay? Or they might be concentrated in a specific area, and you want to pile them all into a specific area so they only can control one district, whereas the dominant group can control all the other districts. That's packing. Cracking is if you have a group of African Americans that would be able to control a district or two. Okay, you can divide them all up. That's called cracking, to make their vote so that it doesn't have any impact in separate districts. I hope I explained that well enough. Okay. Remember that sometimes a member of the presidency is a lame duck. All right, that means that somebody else has been voted to be president, and the current president is just running out the term. That makes the president pretty weak. Okay. Just going through here. All right. Now, things to remember. In a republic, we depend on our representatives to speak and act on our behalf. Who we choose makes a difference. Members of Congress may not be as effective as we want them to be, but they're balancing a lot of interest, and they still manage to get some stuff done sometimes. And party polarization has made it harder. Now, if you want to stop listening about Congress, you can, but I want to talk to you about the budget. Just get this on because budget is a matter of policy that the College Board could ask you about, especially in multiple choice in FRQs. Okay? Remember that the revenue sources, let me make sure I've got this on the right thing. Yes. Remember that the revenue sources for our government are individual income taxes. That's the most, okay? Corporate income taxes, excise taxes, those are taxes on products like tariffs and things like that, I believe. And then social insurance taxes like Social Security and Medicare, okay? The 16th Amendment is what allows the income tax. There was some question about whether or not we could have it without that, so they passed an amendment, all right? Individual income tax was 49% of federal revenue dollars in 2017. Corporate income tax, on the other hand, was only 12%. Then you got social insurance taxes, which have their own buckets, okay? Members of the U.S. are not taxed very much, okay? So don't assume in your answers to questions that we are taxed very heavily. We are not compared to other countries in the world, okay? For the last 3 decades, we have run a budget deficit. That means that we are planning to spend more money than we are planning to spend less money than we actually spend. We spend more money than we planned, okay? That gives us a deficit, all right? Now, as we accumulate those deficits, our national debt rises, the amount of money that we owe, because we have to cover that deficit somehow, all right? And usually we cover it by borrowing money. We could raise taxes. Okay, that's another way we could do it, but we often raise money. Okay, the debt ceiling is the limit on federal borrowing as decided by Congress, and we keep having to move that up because of the extent of our debt, right? This shows you the budget deficits by year, just so you can see them. There are lots of different reasons why you can have a budget deficit. For example, you see a very high budget deficit in 2009 and 11 and 12. That's because we were trying to deal with the recession. Okay, and it goes down after that. Now, how do we decide to spend money? Okay, that's how we raise money. How do we spend money? These are called expenditures. Okay, you can see that national defense is a very big part. The interest on our borrowing is a significant part. Payments for individuals, which include Social Security and Medicare, is a huge part. And then other kinds of things for non-defense, which aren't very much. Okay. Why is spending uncontrollable? Because there are certain amounts of spending that government has to engage in, especially for what we call the entitlements. Okay. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and subsidies. Some subsidies, like farm subsidies, okay, are mandated. So they don't just help the poor. They also help the middle class, right? That's called mandatory spending. The discretionary spending is the optional spending, okay? Now, what areas have we increased our spending on? National security, because of the Cold War and the war against terror, we have a lot more military support and homeland security. Okay, social services have risen in part because people have gotten older and our population has grown. And then incrementalism. Each year we spend a little bit more, and that means each year our budget basically goes up and the deficit goes up. Now, briefly on the budgeting process, this is the process that the budget goes through. It starts with the president. The president has an official called the Office of Management and Budget, and there's somebody who leads that office. And that person coordinates deciding on the budget, okay? So then the agencies, each part of the bureaucracy, works on their budget, and they submit those budgets, those proposed budgets, to the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. The OMB reviews them, prepares a final budget for the president, negotiates with the president about this, figures out what the president wants to do, okay? And this happened recently. The president proposed a budget that was ridiculous in many ways. Anyway, then that budget proposal goes to Congress, and Congress fiddles with it, adopts whatever it wants, which sometimes ignores things the president did because they're non-starters. And then, after Congress approves the budget, they have to approve appropriations bills that authorize spending on the matters in the budget. Okay? This all takes a very long time. And a lot of times we don't get done with it. Okay? But in the time that we should, by the beginning of the new fiscal year. So what we do in that case is we pass something called a continuing resolution. That's a law that allows agencies to continue to spend at the rate they did in the prior year while the government agrees on the budget. Okay, I needed to go through some of that stuff so that you understood a little bit about budget policy, and I wanted to remind you of that. All right. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Ms. Wessel's review on Congress, and I thought I might do presidency, but I think we have done enough. Just for those of you who are listening, I will post the recording of this when I can get it processed, and I will also let you know about review sessions for next week. What I'm thinking about is doing a review on Monday or Tuesday and a review on Friday instead of doing 3 sessions in person. If you want to do, we might do another online session, though, in addition to that. Okay? Let me know if you have thoughts on that. Otherwise, I'll see you when I see you.